Thank you, and thank you for having me. I am one of these people that is adjacent to what you are all doing, so I'm going to talk about a bunch of things which are from my specialization. And there are two kind of big, well, one kind of claim that I'm going to end up making, and another thing which is, I would say, more of an invitation or a provocation, maybe. About how the work that I've been doing may, in an interesting way, connect with some of the issues and the questions and the pursuits that you all have. I don't know if you've ever had a speaker from a design school before. That may be a little bit unusual. The design that I do is not about things like products or websites, things like that. My background is in, well, a whole bunch of things, but right now, strategic design. So how do you take the design sensibility and design mentality and solve for complicated things and think more strategically about what you might do? So it's a very sort of future-facing side of the world. And what I'm going to be sharing today, one is, both of them are about taking the combination of design, behavioral science, and systems. And in my mind, and a lot of what I'll talk about here, is that we can take this away from the whole conversation around nudging. There's nothing wrong with nudging, but it has sort of dominated the discourse for a long time. I think behavioral science and behavioral design has the opportunity to really deal much more sophisticated ways in complex adaptive systems. So I'll be talking about that. And then the other piece, I should have flipped this title, is to also talk about this notion of pattern languages, which is about how we might sort of take a broader view on how to look not just at individual solutions, but to think more broadly about what does it mean to actually construct solutions across a much wider space. So those are kind of the two big things. I've been assured I can talk as long as I want. I would love to do some talking, but also if there are questions, obviously, I would love to continue the conversation. So first, I don't know how familiar behavioral science is for many folks. So I figured I would just start with a little bit of just top level. Frequently, when people are thinking about kind of the economic, the rational view about how we think, how we operate, how we make decisions, it's kind of predicated on claims like this, that we are always rational deliberators. You know, earlier, for example, hearing about risk and probabilistic determination, the fact that we think, we have all our necessary information, and that we act in our own best interests. So when you talk to economists, and I don't mean to point the finger at economists, but it's sort of this economic sense of what we do and how we behave. It all makes sense according to this fairly rational model. And yet that's often not true. And in fact, all of us have probably made several irrational, quote unquote, decisions. I get tired of doing air quotes. So whenever I say the word rational or irrational, pretend that I'm air quoting. Because the language itself is sort of problematic. I don't think that's necessarily a claim you can make. But we have certain heuristics and shortcuts. It's just the way our brains operate. So that's just true. We make, you know, shortcuts when we're deciding things. We don't have all the information we need, and we certainly can't always determine it. And frankly, these days, sometimes we have too much. And our bigger problem is that we don't know what's good information, what's bad. So that's hard. And we certainly don't always act in our quote unquote best interests, right? If what that comes down to is like eat the apple, not the cookie, like everyone's eating dessert right now, right? That may or may not be the thing you want to do. But it's contextual. Right, so we're here, we're sort of celebrating the end of several days of great conversation. There are certainly times when, in context, it makes sense to do things that, you know, wouldn't make sense elsewhere. So this is sort of the big picture of often what behavioral scientists are thinking about and trying to solve for. A couple of terms that may be familiar that come along with this, the notion of choice architecture has become quite popular and recognized. It's essentially what it sounds like, where you're architecting choice conditions. So a classic example is, you know, the salad bar, where you put the healthy stuff up front, people fill their plates. By the time you get to the end, you don't have room for the cake and cookies, etc. So that's an example of choice architecture. You're architecting how people make decisions. The more kind of complicated or slightly more nuanced way of talking about it, it frequently targets very kind of what is considered a last mile decision. So it's often at the point of decision making. So the salad bar, you're not signing up for something a week ago, you're right in front, you know, of the salad bar. It's very often, almost exclusively, looking at behavior change. So what you used to do versus what you might do. And I want to keep that distinction because I think behavior change is different than behavior. Again, often about the immediate environment. Nudging has also become kind of an overused term, but the idea that you're, helping people to do what they want to do, they just don't always do it. So you're helping them to do things, but you're also staying out of their way, right? Importantly, you're not forcing decisions on people. There's a whole conversation we could have that I'm not going to start about sort of what the right level of paternalism is, because sometimes we actually really need help people to help us do the things that are right. Sometimes terms like light paternalism or asymmetric paternalism, all sorts of terms get used here. But essentially this idea that we'll help you do the right thing and we'll stay out of your way if you're not doing that is what that boils down to. So that's all really well and good. And there's a lot of activity. This is actually like the breaking news. I think this just came out in October, earlier this month. This is showing in behavioral public policy. 631, this might be self-reported, so this may not be exactly right. But if you factor that also, there are many, many firms and corporations and private companies that also have behavioral science units. It's really, I wouldn't say it's taking over, but it's become very prevalent all over the world. So there still is a fair dominance global north-wise, I would say, but there's an awful lot of activity. Dealing with everything from, again, kind of small scale, there's behavioral science and things like app development. But many of the folks, for example, that I work with and am more interested in sort of pursuing these ideas with, working global development or humanitarian issues, right? These are big, complicated challenges. This is not just nudging behavior. It really has to take into consideration complexity. So we have behavioral science and this idea of choice architecture. I'm a designer. And my entry into this field is partly, I was intrigued by behavioral science. I think behavioral science is really interesting, but it often felt like it was missing something. And I do think that design has a lot to offer. And I'm not the only one. I'm not standing up here as the only representative. But the fact that design can kind of complement and supplement many of the things that behavioral science maybe doesn't do quite as well lends a lot of sort of possibilities here. So again, just want to clarify what design means, because when I say I'm a designer, people sometimes ask, like, oh, are you a graphic designer or an architect? Or I sometimes get fashion designer, which makes no sense at all, because that's not my vibe. The way that I think about design and the way that my school thinks about design is that it really is more a mode of inquiry. It's a set of methods. So it's a way that we approach problems, not just about kind of making slides pretty or doing something which is kind of, it's not only a process, it's actually a way that we consider what is the right question to ask. The notion of what counts as evidence in design can be much broader potentially than in science, because part of what we're trying to understand and look for are like, what are the ways that we can implicitly understand from what people are doing, what might we need to pay attention to. So this idea of abductive thinking is actually quite key often to how designers approach problems, where part of what we're doing is understanding and thinking about, well, what could be, what's plausible? And it doesn't mean that we're satisfied just with kind of imagining stuff, but it can be a very helpful way of sort of probing questions that you wouldn't think to ask, which actually came up in a couple of talks earlier on. It's also incredibly helpful for problems that don't really have an answer yet, things that are more future facing. Design can be quite useful because it can help to identify opportunities and to imagine what isn't there yet. So again, this is taking a little bit more of a strategic view about what designers can do, but this is a little bit more of the world that I'm playing in. And when we talk about design, along with that comes research. So the type of research that informs the sort of design I do. Some of it comes from human-centered design, which may be a familiar term. HCD has been around for quite some time at this point. This is really a way of understanding deeply through qualitative, not just things like surveys, but interviews, observations, kind of being able to truly understand what somebody's lived experience is like. The challenge with a survey, for example, is that they can only answer, if you give seven options, people choose one of those 7 options. But sometimes the most useful thing you can find out is a question you didn't think to ask, but somebody started to answer something, and it gives you now new insight into what those people might be thinking about. It also, in contrast with behavioral science research, where behavioral science research is often about kind of broad tendencies, right? What it is to be human. So the idea of something like availability or anchoring, those are kind of terminologies. Those have been around since humans have been around. So anchoring, for example, that once you see a number or kind of get situated, it's hard to remove that anchor from the way that you experience everything else. That's true of just lots and lots of things, whereas design can go much more deeply into what people's actual experiences are. The term frame plurality I like to use, it's a little bit fancy, but it's also kind of, again, getting at that we're not individual, we're not brains in jars. It's kind of one flippant way to say it. We all have experiences that radically change how we might experience the same choice in the same choice environment. And then finally, understanding a broader sense of choice conditions. So rather than just focusing on the immediate environment, for example, understanding what have people made decisions about in the past? What are the ways in which the choice conditions of things like social norms are impacting us? So again, design and behavioral science research, in this case, are both useful. They're not substitutes for one another, but I find them very useful as complements. So just as a very concrete example, because that is all a bit abstract, we all lived through COVID. We're still living through COVID, arguably. And behavioral science had a lot. It was so interesting as somebody who studies and works in this field, because on the one hand, I was experiencing COVID just like all of you. Then the other part of me was like, this is fascinating. This is such an interesting behavioral science experiment that we did not consent to. But if we think about how behavioral scientists would approach it, it kind of comes down to like, okay, you're trying to convince somebody to wear a mask. What does that look like? What's effective? Perhaps even what's effective in different cultures. So for example, studies in Italy showed that social norms and pro-social norms were much stronger. In the US, things more like making it easier, loss aversion, for example. So it's not only one type of solution, but you sort of have a palette of options. Whereas the designer in me says, well, there's so much more we have to think about. There's so many reasons that people don't do certain things. Some of it is just really kind of, what feels sort of simple and easy to overcome, like the mask need was an issue, right? Where sometimes if people wore masks all the time, it would irritate their skin. Seems like having a horrible disease is maybe worse than just that, but that would be enough to keep people from doing it. Lots of different conflicting amounts of information, different types of rule sets, etc. So coming from a broader perspective, what this just tells us is that it's not just about instilling a behavior or encouraging a behavior, but about understanding what conditions are people responding to. That's a much more complicated question. And in fact, we can even get more detailed and more uncomfortable in some ways. There was real concern, for example, that when, in wearing a mask, racial profiling is still alive and well and with us. And it might also mean then that the fear of wearing a mask and also worrying that somebody was going to think of you as a potential threat, right? It's like two sources of health risk are at play here, right? There's the kind that we're all familiar with in terms of public health, but there's also the sense that I don't want to be kind of targeted or seen as a threat. So this quote always sort of struck me, right? I'm a Black man living in this world. I want to stay alive, but I also want to stay alive. It shouldn't be a choice, but it can be. And I sometimes call this posture. So again, this isn't just about the choices that we make, but our posture towards choice is something that design research can help us to do, because it helps us recognize like why somebody might be choosing something over another. So now this is our new formula. But that's not, even this is not enough, because one of the things that like I said, this is historically behavioral science has been treated as kind of a discrete thing. I do think it's more complex than that and more systemic. And I'm not alone in thinking that. So Eric Johnson, a very well-known behavioral scientist, has sort of said something similar, right? Like we don't just think about choice architecture of the immediate environment. We really need to be thinking about that in complex environments. And he's talking here specifically about, he just says complex organizations and systems. What's interesting to me though, is that he's still sticking with the term choice architecture, right? So there still is this sense of kind of last mile problem solving that we might be doing. So let's probe on that a little bit. This was published. It's a piece that I co-wrote several years ago, and every time I see it, it bothers me a little bit. There shouldn't be a stark line down the middle. That is very artificial. But what we were trying to say with this piece is that there are multiple ways of thinking about even the nature of what it is that we're solving. Right, if we're looking at something which is in this lower left corner, by the way, this where to play, how to win, it's like a Roger Martin thing from people who've gone to business school might sort of recognize that construct. If we are looking at individual behavior and we're looking sort of more clearly at kind of specific inputs that we might want to change, behavioral science might be perfectly good at that, right? There are sort of ways in which that targeted use can be quite powerful, and that's fine. It's not throwing that away. However, the more complex and the more complicated we are trying to sort of solve into. So for example, if we're looking at more sort of multi-stakeholder or even systemic solutions, behavioral science doesn't have tools for this currently. It's really primarily focused on, again, individual behavior change and how do we change immediate environments. There's just, it currently is not yet methodology to look further upstream. Similarly, if we're trying to create groups that are entirely new, less so. There still, again, are not necessarily methods to do that. Arguably, things like computation, actually, what you all are good at could play across all of this. So I'm not even sort of including that part in the mix, but recognizing that the more that we get into these larger questions, more what ifs, sort of more plausibility rather than causality, we do need different tools, and design can help in that regard as well. So, okay, now we have an even more complicated formula here. We have choice architecture, choice posture. Now I want to talk a little bit about what does it mean to include systems in this. One, I like metaphors. So one metaphor that we can use here to expand upon what it looks like to go beyond choice architecture is think of a plant. I don't know if any of you have green thumbs, right? And if you think about a plant that you're trying to cultivate, you choose the right seed and you make sure that it has the right amount of water and you do everything you can to help that little plant grow, right? That's sort of, to my mind, that's sort of where choice architecture tends to sit. We're looking very specifically at a specific kind of thing. What I've taken to sort of working on, and a lot of where my current research is currently, is how do we take that idea and not just kind of dial it up, but think just differently about what it is that we're designing for. So the idea of choice infrastructure as a way to augment or to add on to this is it's something that I'm not the only one who's interested in this, but what this forces us to do is it forces us to look at, well, what are the sort of larger systems, right? When we look at levels of infrastructure, it means that we're not just solving for individual solutions, but we're looking at kind of what are the structures and systems that are in place behind that. What are the ways in which things like processes or structures can support this kind of work? I used to be a consultant before I became an academic, and one of the things that kind of prompted my thinking around this was, so I would come in, I would be part of the team, and we were there to solve for innovation, which is a problematic word actually, but let's forget that. We were there to help companies be more innovative. That was why they brought us in. And they would sit us down and we would have a conversation. They would say, we don't know why people aren't innovative. We tell them all the time to be innovative. We give them tools to be innovative. Why don't they do it? And you only have to ask this question a couple of times and you start to see a pattern. The reason people aren't innovative is because nothing about the structures and systems and performance management and incentives, nothing about the actual things that kind of keep a company running have anything to do with innovation. They're really about, like, did you deliver the last quarter? Where are your sales for this moment? So if you're going to be talking about behavior change and you don't also consider the infrastructural supports in there, you are not going to be that successful if you're thinking about anything that has larger relationships, right? Because there's a lot that will be holding things in place otherwise. So this idea about looking at choice infrastructure can not only be useful just as a broader set of choice conditions, it can also arguably help make the choice architecture that you are creating much more robust, because it means you actually have a system that's going to back this things up. And I'm not the only one, again, who has thought this. Somebody who's won the Nobel Prize is a smarter person than I have. But she also sort of says something similar, right? Where, like, when we think about structures, when we think about the activities that are occurring within those structures, if green thumb, plants don't work for you, maybe plumbing. does. The idea that we can think about plumbing in a sense of systems as another way to understand how we sort of underlying infrastructures help us to know what is going to work, right? You can't choose fixtures or a toilet or a sink until you know how the plumbing is actually going to work. That is your primary kind of structural decision that can help other things after that. But the other thing she talks about, which I think is really important too, and we'll come back to this, is that there's also there's thinking about where power resides is equally important, right? The people who decide how infrastructure gets created are also often the ones who are in charge of what types of things matter. So that can be an extremely significant prompt. If you're talking again about an organization and you're deciding what counts in a performance management review, that's not something typically the employee chooses. That's something which is much more at a business model level. So who has the power to decide what infrastructures are supporting what? That is not something we can ignore. It's actually equally important when we're designing for behavior. In thinking about choice infrastructure, I realize when I use this term, it can sometimes imply things that are very, very kind of technically structured or more kind of tangible. In the way that I tend to think about this and use it, it is a more a much broader perspective. So yes, there are certainly ways in which choice infrastructure in the form of technology, for example, can have a significant sense. People who don't have fast internet, for example, are prevented from applying for certain jobs, right? If you have to go to a library to apply for a job, it means that certain things are more limited there. So just digital access is really, really important. In a less sort of digital world, right? Sometimes like in certain areas of the world where it's hard to get fresh water, telling people, oh, wash your hands or take care of certain sort of hygiene, like it's a different message that you have to give because the conditions are just different. There are many, many social cultural ways in which infrastructure gets embedded. My husband is in the healthcare field, and so hierarchical determination there is a huge infrastructural issue. It depends, you know, it matters who you are talking to when it comes down to decision making, et cetera. But even things like just the expectations that we have of one another. There are sort of these social contracts and infrastructures that we tend to set up, which rule how we behave and what we think is acceptable. I already talked about things like performance management. So ways that we think about the procedural financial incentives, those are enormous. Like, well, follow the money, right? That's the quote. And even in spatial settings. Like I happened to work in a building, the architect decided it was going to be the first building, I think, that was an educational environment that was open plan. Not successful. Like open plan is great for collaboration sometimes, but sometimes I need to shut a door and like be away from the world. Anyone who's worked in both of these environments knows quite well that the behaviors are extremely different. The way that you interact, even how you think about who's busy, who's not busy, it is not the same. It's not just a physical environment. So now we have this full formula of behavioral science, design and systems, choice architecture, posture, and infrastructure. They are not independent entities. And this is something I realized I didn't put the paper title here, but this is something that I sort of talk about in a little bit more detail in a public health setting. If we think about it, these really are related. So for example, I already was talking a bit about how the choice infrastructure, the plumbing, can impact whether things work, right? Whether your choice interventions are going to be successful or not. But the conditions that we live in from an infrastructural level also can have a huge influence on our posture towards things. Again, I was in a consulting business for a long time. The things that I liked doing, the work I wanted to pursue, or the fact that I liked mentoring, did not really jive with the infrastructure that I was working in at that time. So that created a certain sense in my mind about whether I was going to stay or leave. So again, these are interconnected. These are not just isolated things. To make things even more confusing and complicated, of course, like this is never happening just in a single slice of time. So we have to recognize that when interventions are put out into the world, there are several competing conditions that are going on. And this is probably, again, not news to many of you who are thinking about all these types of complexity, but even the fact that interventions change the environment they're put into is not something that behavioral science always pursues. So oftentimes it's, did we get behavior change? Did the success rates of whatever change we were trying to occur without realizing that sometimes it changes the way that we think about subsequent decisions or subsequent interventions. We also have ways in which the ecosystem itself may be adapting, or even individuals, right? We can do, sometimes there's this term reactance can occur where people kind of rebel against an intervention if it's happened before, for example. We can also see how the boundaries of the problem themselves might be changing. The version of this paper, I won't go into this in detail, but it was also focused on COVID. I did a lot of work during COVID because I got a tenure track position in 2019. So suddenly COVID was what everyone was talking about. But the boundaries of the challenge there were radically different. First, it was about, what is the source of contagion? Those of you, did people, people might have washed their mail, right? Everyone was worried about things getting transferred in just by touch. Turned out that wasn't the case. So once we realized that it was more airborne, then of course we had to think differently about that. So the idea that interventions themselves can be brittle unless we're thinking about not just systems, but also considering what's changing over time, just makes, again, a whole new set of things that behavioral science, in my mind, is not currently equipped to do, and demands some new thinking about what are tools and methods and approaches that we can do this. I will also say, and it's interesting that I'm talking here today, because just in the past month or so, there have been several articles or op-eds that are taking a very different position. So I'm not saying I'm being especially brave by taking this stance. There are other folks who agree with this, but there has been some interesting pushback lately on the idea that behavioral science needs to be systemic and look at complexity. Some of that is around kind of wanting to make sure that there's a certain level of kind of causality and sort of scientific precision that sticks around. That has been a calling card of behavioral science for a long time. So the idea that we're kind of opening this can of worms about looking at more complex situations is not comfortable to everyone. And I'm not saying this at all to make fun. I think that that's actually a very valid stance. I personally think there's room for both. I think we need to have methods and ways of thinking about sort of more targeted behavioral challenges, but also be thinking about ways that if we don't consider how we're dealing with behavior and solving for behavior in more complicated situations, we're leaving a lot off the table. So again, there are ways in which the decision-making for ourselves versus the system, right? We know that many of these things are sort of extras that we need to be thinking about. They're beyond just looking at behavioral change, but if we're going to solve for behavior in more complex conditions, they're essential. We can't leave these off the table. I'm just going to talk, this is going to be sort of the end of one arc, and then I will pick up on the next. But one of the things that I've been working on, and this is actually, it's changed a little bit, but a version of this is something that I've been using and working with International Rescue Committee, IRC, which is a humanitarian organization. They're one of my kind of partners in crime in trying to explore and expand upon what are different ways that we can use a combination of methods. So looking at behavioral science methods, design methods, complex systems methods in conjunction. I feel very strongly that this is, when we talk about really complex issues, it is not for one discipline to solve. That just does not make sense to me. It requires both looking at things through different lenses, but also recognizing that different approaches are really essential if we're going to be solving for these. So what I'm sharing here is kind of an early version. We've evolved it since then. But one of the things that we need to do, for example, if we're looking at behavior and solving for that, is actually understanding kind of the different levels at which the mechanisms themselves might be occurring. So starting at the bottom and moving up, again, choice architecture and interventions. There may be certain types of things where just solving at a very simple level actually does the trick. We want to be able to understand, how do we create solutions that are specific to moments of decision-making. Choice infrastructure at another level. Sometimes what we need to be solving for is more complicated and we need to deal with the plumbing. If we don't actually solve for that, we're not going to solve problems well. And then finally, that top level, ideology is kind of a big word, but recognizing where the power in systems sits. What are the belief systems that sort of help keep sometimes unstable systems the way they are, or keep stable systems unhealthy, right? We need to be considering all of those. Similarly, micro, meso, and macro levels of how to consider things. This, by the way, I'm doing some work. This is not from the IRC work, but I'm doing some work with students on extreme heat. So recognizing how do people respond to extreme heat conditions. That's why these examples are here. So again, recognizing from sort of small scale to community to more societal, what are the ways that we can look and function and work at different levels? And in conjunction, kind of recognizing this is not just about a static picture, but what we've been working on both with my students and also with IRC. First, how do we simply identify what are the things that we need to be considering? Because otherwise we could leave things off the table. And also, how do things, once we start to populate something like this, how do they impact each other? So that can lead to even just simple things like causal loop diagrams are one way to do that. But also to imagine futures, right? If we were to change one thing, what are ways in which we might change others? So that's kind of the one arc. That's sort of why do we need to think about behavior from a complex systems perspective? It's because many of the challenges that we're looking at are much, much bigger than nudging. If we're looking at humanitarian crises and behavior change or gender-based violence, those are not nudge issues. Those are about understanding how systems work and what to do about it. What I want to just talk about here, this is a little bit more speculative, I suppose, but it's also a problem that I think behavioral science is dealing with or needs to deal with. And there may be ways that we can expand upon it. So this is where I don't think that all of us in this room are necessarily going to be able to solve this directly either, but there may be ways in which teeing this up can be useful. Currently, behavioral science and applied behavioral design tends to look at individual solutions, right? We solved one thing really, really well, and we solved for bounded rationality. People are familiar with this, came up with Simon. But it's also led, this emphasis on precision has made it really hard to scale things, because it's very hard to scale something which is bespoke into a much wider way of understanding sort of implement solutions, right? And there are lots of reasons why this is true. So in behavioral science, often we generate sources of truth from the lab, right? That's how we start to understand how people behave and general tendencies, but that does not match the outside world. So by oversimplifying, you can make that harder. Obviously, sometimes there are just multiple factors going on at once. And oftentimes simplifying away that complexity is a way the problem solving occurs. Contextual heterogeneity is a big issue because no situation is the same. We can't have a solution in the US and assume the same situation or the same solution is going to work in South Korea. Right? Uncertainty effects over time. And of course, they're just sort of the general issues that we come across. For some reason, I find it useful to use a dog metaphor here. There have been attempts to think about how to generalize in behavioral science. So again, it's not that we haven't thought about this at all, but it tended to be kind of one-off. And this is roughly chronological, it feels like. So initially, there was this sort of urge to say like, oh, we found a tendency. Now, where can we find it elsewhere? Because that's what's interesting. So that's where you're just like giving puppies away, like there's no tomorrow. There can also then, they turned into, well, okay, now we know a lot about habits. Where can we start to solve for that? And that means now you're on a search for habits everywhere. So like, you've seen one habit, you've seen them all. And that can start to lend itself again to incomplete solutions. Finding solutions that work in one place and assuming they'll work elsewhere, of course, we know that there are going to be issues with that because of context. But even if we think about context, we can sort of quickly run into, again, the sort of one-off problem where we solve for one thing and not for another. And then the idea of mechanism experiments has been used a little bit, not quite caught on quite as much, but as a way to sort of understand, well, what are the processes underlying this? So essentially, these have all happened a bit in isolation, and that's made it also a bit hard to scale. So again, if you have hammers looking for nails, you also have just system forces, so these don't accommodate, because a lot of those generalization tendencies are about the solution or about the problem itself, whereas the system forces more broadly may keep you from actually instituting certain types of solutions. There are emergent conditions, of course, the idea that once you sort of put something into play, it will change the nature of what it is that you're looking for. Maybe you need a cat, right? Maybe a dog isn't even what you wanted in the first place. And also precision itself is not always the best option. So the idea of sometimes it's better to avoid misfits than to actually find best fit. can be good. Anyone who has tried to choose a movie with a variety of people probably knows this well, right? If you there's no possible way you find the same movie that everyone wants to see. And you can't just satisfy one person because then everyone else is upset. So sometimes satisficing, even in the behavioral world, can be useful, right? You solve just enough, so you're going to get the results you need, even if it's not perfect. So this general idea of what I'm calling behavioral pattern language, I'll talk about that in a moment. And I don't know, I like language, so choice architecture is what we can call that, right? How do we think more broadly about sort of the notion of different types of choices that we're making and different types of solutions? So pattern language may or may not be familiar. It was a term and a sort of, not just a term, a whole methodology that was introduced by Christopher Alexander, who was an architect. This was back in the 70s, so this is actually not recent news. I think he just passed away a few years ago. But the idea of pattern languages is that it was a way to solve for problems essentially by breaking them down and understanding how to reconstruct and to use those component parts in surprising ways that solve problems again and again, such that you can do it, many, many times, but you're not reducing it to rote formula. You have a certain set of components that you have determined are useful for solving certain types of problems, and you can put them back together. I mean, if you think about it, that's what a language is, right? We have vocabulary, we have phrases, we have syntax, we have ways of understanding what I'm talking about right now, and the tone of my voice and the way that I'm operating here is not the way I would talk to my grandmother, right? So we have a certain contextual sensibility there as well. This is literally just from one of his books. He came up with, I don't know how many hundreds of patterns, but it was a very manual, bespoke sensibility first, obviously about architecture. And what he's indicating here, for example, is that in this sort of set of conditions, there are certain types of attributes which are going to be functional and useful, but there are different ways of solving for it. So it's almost like you have a set of design principles, and now you can start to understand how to put those together. Not surprisingly, perhaps, it's caught on in other industries. Oddly enough, it did not catch on at all in architecture. It comes from an architect, but architects were like, nope. It felt, I think, a little bit too rule-based, seemed to be the sense. Huge, though, in certain areas where there is this interesting combination of wanting to kind of institute regularity while still having a ton of flexibility. Like, think about all the apps you have on your phones. If you had to relearn a whole new interface for every single thing you did, it would be horrible, right? So that regularity is quite useful, and yet we still need the flexibility to do whatever we want. But it's also been used, the same pattern language idea, even if not in architecture, in biology, in education. There's a whole set of other disciplines that have found it quite useful, because it kind of has this interesting ability to marry both analytics and also generative sort of problem solving. So you can be an analytic about how you break things down, but also it means that you can create quite a bit of stuff. So one of the benefits, if we were to go down this route, is that it actually does help with certain things. So this idea of lowering the bar to entry, because it kind of gives you a bunch of component parts that you can start with. I'm always reminded by like 3D modeling, you know, how there are the catastrophic fails if you 3D model poorly. Like if you give somebody a little bit of a help so that they're not going to like absolutely destroy their model, that kind of thing can be quite useful. So it also raises the floor of quality, because if you give people a starting point that certain things tend to work well together, experts can always override that and do a better job, but at least you're not starting from scratch. It also can democratize access. So if there's a set of useful design principles that we can start to think about, that's useful. And again, this idea of avoiding misfits can be sort of beneficial. We know that we're not going to get something which is a terrible solution. So this is sort of the last sort of chunk. In terms of applying it to behavioral problem solving, right? This is sort of where I started. Pattern languages have some interesting potential because again, they're good at looking at sort of breaking down complexity and building it back up to create different solutions and being able to combine this combination of both analytics and synthesis to get us somewhere. There are a couple of articles already published. There's one, literally, it's like it should be out. It's probably going to come out tomorrow, given my luck, that is coming out fairly soon that I'm just going to talk a little bit about so you know where I'm going with this. So generally speaking, if we take this overall approach, and we think of it as applied to behavioral systems, it can get us some interesting perspectives. So first of all, we have a lot of vocabulary. If we think about vocabulary as behavioral insights or ways of understanding why it is that people do certain things at certain times. We also have ways of understanding how those structures might work together. And we also have a lot of information about what happens in certain contexts. The problem is frequently these are just in case studies, which are independent. So it's hard to make patterns if you only have a single set of cases. But if we do it well, we may be able to create ways that we kind of make coherence out of individual instances, and also, again, think about this combination of analytic and generative approaches. So this is just sort of a high-level look at the paper. Like I said, it's coming out fairly soon, forthcoming. But just to get a sense of where this is going, and then thinking about a little bit, computation might be helpful here. I do have to give very explicit credit, by the way, my collaborator, Caitlin Stenger, who's the first author here. The paper is based on some of the work that she did during her PhD, so really great collaborator, and also I'm getting full credit to the person who did a lot of kind of the legwork here. But this was the overall approach, was looking at sustainability in this case and thinking about how do we collect these cases, one, how do we start to analyze them, and then also what does it tell us about patterns. So in the actual sort of first, one of the challenges here was even figuring out what are the cases to look for. Because currently there is not a consistent way of capturing behavioral outputs. It often shows up, for example, in grade literature, right? There's already, about things like publication bias, where results of things that didn't work or kind of worked but not really don't often make it into publications. So just even finding the data here is kind of one recognizable challenge. Looking across international sites, and again, like the inclusion here, she was very focused in the specific set of real world, obviously things like identifiable within 20 minutes, like that's a human capacity thing, but you can imagine that if we had, more sort of data scraping ways of doing that, that would be easier. And it was also very focused on sustainability. That was kind of the concept here. Obviously, there were some exclusion criteria. So in some cases, it was either just incomplete or didn't have, was around things that weren't really germane. Then taking a look, obviously some of those cases were not themselves complete, or they didn't have the right kinds of information, or they weren't sufficient to what it is that we wanted to do. So starting at the end of 201, there were only 33 high quality cases, but at least sufficient numbers that we could start to make some, sense out of that. Here again, this is the dog is just here as a reminder for me. What's interesting is that, again, if we think about patterns as sort of an expansion and improvement on looking at individual criteria for seeing where we might be able to generalize, many of these same sort of features are the same as what people had tried to look for generalizability in the past, with patterns that we can start to look at connections between them. So it's not just saying, oh, there's a certain solution that got used, but it's looking at what solution for what kind of challenge and did it work. So not going to read all this text, but this is kind of an example of one of the patterns that got established. So again, this was looking at, several, looking through first a couple hundred, then several dozen different ways of thinking about what are high level ways of understanding approaches to problems. In this case, this idea of community agreements, for example, was effective in certain kinds of conditions, had certain kinds of contexts that it was referring to. There were certain kind of solution components. And the whole idea here was that it was a matter of looking for things that were not precise and exact, because then if you have a pattern of one, that's not particularly useful, but being able to see like where there's some of these sort of higher level principles that we might apply elsewhere. So this is where it showed up. Again, like it's not special. I'm just using that one illustratively, so just showing where it's at. But what was interesting here is that there were certain types in the sustainability setting, certain types of solutions, problems, contexts, which tended to show up with great regularity, and we started to be able to make some claims out of that. What was even more interesting is that once we start to look at them in comparison and in conjunction, recognizing that certain types of solutions made sense together, or were actually nicely complementary, right? And others stay by themselves, like the fact that defaults during enrollment are kind of isolated up there. looking at that as somebody who knows this field makes sense because defaults are kind of known as one of the sort of most prominent or most successful types of interventions. So just by itself, it's likely to actually make a dent. Some of these others might actually benefit from, for example, from reinforcement. So again, this is like using a fairly small data set. It was really more than anything proof of concept and being able to sort of start to see like, A, is this even a viable way of thinking about how to solve for these types of challenges? And what could we do if we were to sort of turbo boost this and see? So there are different ways of thinking about like the next steps that we're working on to see what could make sense of this. One of my colleagues at my school is sort of more in the computational field as well. So he's been starting to talk about this too. I mean, being able to move from just a very, very manual process, which is what this was in the past, to something which is more systematic, but also recognizing, you know, where we could actually look across several different dimensions. That's not something that people are necessarily very good at, to find different patterns. Being able to think about different thresholds for things. So again, like right now, the data set and what we came up with here was fairly sort of single valued, but being able to sort of recognize, oh, there's certain types of combinations that may make more sense. How do we start to boost that so we can start to make some sort of more useful claims? And then over time, like being able to see sort of what works, right? Oftentimes, one of the challenges is that results get put forward and they're only about capturing, was there behavior change, for example? There's not as much opportunity right now or in the current data to see what changes over time, but that would be also useful. Of course, there are 1 million, this is just a small set. There are lots of challenges to thinking about how this might work. It's very difficult to track down this information, and when you can track it down, it's often captured in very inconsistent ways because people have it, you know, stored on disk drives or in reports that's not necessarily that accessible. And being able to even to think about what's missing, right? Like I said, a lot of the work is being done in the global north. That also means that the global south is relatively underrepresented, which is a problem. What does seem like an interesting possibility is also being able to, through work like this, start to understand, well, how can we start to identify what matters more? So it's not just looking at sort of individual cases, but how do we, you know, start to make some sense of that? And then also one of the things that I'm always quite interested in, not just because I'm a design person, but the more sophisticated tools get, the harder it can be for practitioners to feel confident and comfortable using them. So being able to think both about like, what are inputs, ways that we can extract or capture information that somebody who does not have a sophisticated technical background feels comfortable doing, feels confident, but also thinking about things like visualizations, outputs, recognizing sort of different ways, different modes and modalities of being able to even read that data is also something that we're interested in. So that's that. Happy to chat